The Dominion War had raged for over a year. Planets were occupied, fleets were shattered. Allies died alone, and ideals, once unshakable, were quietly buried beneath the cost of survival. Starfleet wasn't winning, it was enduring. In Part 1, we traced that collapse, the fall of Beta Z, Sisko's desperate deception, and the moment the impossible happened, the Romulan Star Empire entered the war. It was a turning point, not because it was guaranteed victory, but because for the first time, the Dominion had to fight on 3 fronts. For the first time, they blinked. Within weeks, Romulan warbirds struck 15 Dominion bases. Klingons recaptured Benzar with Romulan support. And at Deep Space Nine, Starfleet began planning its first true offensive, a joint assault on the Chintaka system. But that momentum came at a price. Captain Benjamin Sisko, once the moral compass of Deep Space Nine, had forged evidence, manipulated a senator, and traded truth for victory. He would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. But even then, he believed it was necessary. Elam Garak didn't hesitate. He saw the Dominion for what it was, irredeemable. And if lies were the path to victory in war, so be it. On Cardassia, Legate Damar, recently elevated after Ducat's breakdown, found himself a leader in name only. His orders came from the Vorta, his power from the Founders. The resentment had begun to fester. Chancellor Gowron continued to posture, basking in the glow of past glories. But real leadership belonged to General Martok, the soldier's hero, who now shared command with Admiral Ross and Romulan strategists. The Chintaka system was chosen for one reason: vulnerability. With Jem'Hadar reinforcements pulled to counter the Romulans, its defenses were thinned, relying on automated platforms and planetary weapon grids. Cardassians had fortified the system with plasma turrets and regenerative shielding, but their reliance on centralized power would prove to be their undoing. The orbital grid was state-of-the-art, powered from the planet below, and designed to repel even a full-scale fleet. But Starfleet had a plan: hit the power core hard. By mid-2374, ships began massing at Deep Space Nine. Federation, Klingon, Romulan. 3 flags, once enemies, now united by necessity. Romulan intelligence officers now walked the halls of Deep Space Nine. It was an alliance born of necessity, not trust. Bajor remained officially neutral, bound by a non-aggression pact with the Dominion, and the war effort, as it always had, continued to flow through its system. But now, it was the Federation that was present. And for better or worse, Deep Space Nine was once again the tip of the spear. Even within the Federation, there was dissent. Some questioned whether an invasion was the right move, whether ideals had been sacrificed for expediency. But in the end, the Council gave its approval. And across Federation space, for the first time in months, hope stirred. On colony worlds and core planets alike, people dared to believe the tide might finally turn. This was no longer just about defense. It was about proving the Dominion could be hurt. And so, for the first time in the war, the Federation and its allies prepared to strike. Not to hold the line, not to retreat, but to take something back. The invasion of Chintaka was about to begin. Before we continue, I want to highlight something rare, something I genuinely believe in. This episode is sponsored by Spice Frontier, Escape from Veltagar, and it's not just another plug. I've supported this project twice now, and there's a reason. It deserves to go further. The pilot is live right now on the Steamroller Stories YouTube channel, created by Steamroller Animation, a fully independent studio led by DreamWorks veteran Jalil Sadul. And this story? It's what happens when Star Trek meets Anthony Bourdain. Set centuries after Earth's destruction, Spice Frontier follows Kentucky Williams, a human chef with a dream. He's not a war hero, he's a healer, empathetic, curious, and deeply committed to reconnecting a fractured galaxy, one spice at a time. Traveling with a misfit alien crew and a badass cyborg companion, Kentucky explores forgotten cultures, forgotten worlds, and tries to bring people back together through food, conversation, and shared history. If Bourdain had a starship, this is the show he'd host. The visuals, honestly, are stunning. Flat graphic characters over rich, painterly backdrops powered by Unreal Engine. And it's already resonating with viewers. But this is just the pilot. If enough people watch, comment, and support, it could become a full series. And Steamroller isn't even stopping here. They've got more original animated stories coming to the channel soon. So after this video, hit the link in the description or in the comments. Watch Spice Frontier Escape from Veltigar, because even in a galaxy scarred by war, someone still has to care. The Alliance surged forward. Romulan warbirds moved in from their flanking formation, delivering final strikes to Jem'Hadar pockets. Klingon vessels closed in from above, driving the last resistance to the far edge of the system. In less than an hour, Chintaka was taken. It was the first real victory of the war. But even victories have a cost. Back on Deep Space Nine, as the battle unfolded, Dukat made his move. Disguised and driven by madness, Dukat infiltrated the Bajoran temple. In his possession, a paw wraith sealed in an ancient artifact. Without warning, he released it. The entity struck Jadzia Dax, killing her ultimately, and desecrated the temple. The wormhole closed. What had been a spiritual attack became a strategic one. Reinforcements from the Gamma Quadrant could no longer arrive. The prophets were silent. The sky above Bajor had gone dark. And Benjamin Sisko felt it. In the moment of his greatest military success, he suffered his deepest personal loss. Jadzia's death shattered him. He stepped away from command, from the prophets, from the war. At least, for a time. For Worf, the loss was no less devastating. His grief turned inward, unspoken but raw. He resolved then to win Jadzia's place in Stovokor, setting in motion a personal journey that would lead to bloodshed at Monarch 4. But that came later. For now, Chintaka stood as a broken world and a bloodied victory. Admiral Ross logged the win. Martok saluted his dead. Romulan Senator Latante issued a public statement ensuring that the Empire's contribution would not be forgotten. And in the quieter corners of the fleet, other names were spoken with reverence. Among them, Sisko, the Starfleet pilot who led Strike Team Echo in the final push. As the orbital platforms devastated the front lines, Sixto's team dove into the chaos, drawing fire, disrupting targeting systems, and carving a narrow path forward. Lieutenant Ashton Pierce ignited his aft shields to simulate a core breach, pulling enemy fire long enough for Klingon cruisers to regroup. He ejected seconds later before his fighter was destroyed, rescued by tractor beam in mid-fall. Ensign Everett Johnson, flying a prototype jamming unit, plunged directly into the grid's telemetry field, scrambling Dominion targeting for just long enough. And Sixto, wounded, his ship crippled, delivered the torpedoes that revealed the grid's central weakness. The battle log called it Fighter Interference Pattern Echo. The survivors remembered it as Sixto's Run. Behind closed doors, the strategic maps shifted. The Dominion was wounded, and far away on Cardassia Prime, engineers and defense officials stared at the wreckage of their great weapon system and began to whisper. Is the Dominion fallible? Are we still in control? Legate Damar, who had overseen parts of the orbital grid project, began to feel the stirrings of doubt. The weapons had been foolproof, their failure unthinkable. Perhaps the problem wasn't Cardassia's weapons, but its masters. And for the Dominion itself, the message was clear. The Alpha Quadrant had teeth. The war had entered a new phase. The fire had been lit at Chintaka, but it did not spread. The Dominion had lost a system, not the war. In the months that followed, the Great Offensive stalled. No fleets advanced, no borders shifted. Instead, the stars froze in place, and the war sank into a long and bitter winter. Chintaka, once a symbol of momentum, became a bleeding wound. Contested, unstable, and constantly under attack. The Dominion poured ships into the surrounding sectors. The Allies held their line. Barely. But while the front held, the soul of the war shifted elsewhere. On a nameless rock known only as AR-558, Starfleet claimed a Dominion communications array. High capacity, deeply entrenched, and essential to Dominion fleet coordination. To hold it, they left behind a garrison. The Jem'Hadar came, again and again. Wave after wave. Over 5 months, more than 100 Starfleet officers were killed. Supplies ran thin. Rotations were canceled. Even basic medical equipment began to fail. What was meant to be a tactical asset became a test of endurance and madness. Among those stationed there was Nog, Starfleet's first Ferengi officer. While doing reconnaissance, he was struck by enemy fire. His leg was amputated. He survived, but something in him didn't. While the stars remained still, the ground became a graveyard. Across the quadrant, other battles raged without glory. The Klingon Empire, ever eager for combat, pushed hard into Dominion lines. General Martok led a raid on Monarch 4, striking a critical Dominion logistics station in one of the few true victories of this time. By his side, Worf, still driven by grief over Jadzia Dax. It was more than a mission. It was a rite, a blood offering, a way to secure Jadzia's place in Sto-vo-kor. Elsewhere, on Trelka 5, the old warrior Kor, a Dahar master of the Empire, fought his final battle. Surrounded, outnumbered, and past his prime, he died buying just enough time for Klingon forces to escape a Jem'Hadar ambush. His sacrifice would be remembered, but his loss stung deep. Klingon casualties mounted. Honor was earned, but at a cost. And far from the battlefield, voices in the High Council began to murmur. Some whispered that Martok had grown too close to the Federation, that the Alliance was bleeding the Empire dry. Gowron listened. At Deep Space Nine, the spiritual war continued. Captain Sisko, shattered by Jadzia's death and the silence of the prophets, returned to Earth. The station, once the heart of Federation strategy, fell quiet. Command passed to others. The wormhole remained closed. But in time, Sisko found his path again. Guided by visions, myth, and the counsel of his father, he began a pilgrimage. In a sacred place, he communed with the prophets, and the wormhole reopened. Sisko had come back to the war, but he had changed. He was no longer just a captain. He was something more and something less. Even as battles raged and spirits faltered, the war's shadow deepened. Section 31, still invisible to most, accelerated its operations. Dr. Bashir, back aboard DS-9, began to suspect that Odo's illness was no accident. The shapeshifter's health was declining, but he kept it hidden. Quiet, private, too proud to be pitied, too afraid to ask. Bashir began digging. Elsewhere, the Romulan Star Empire shifted its posture, not with fleets, but with whispers. Cloaked listening posts appeared along neutral corridors. Starfleet officers were shadowed. Intelligence leaks tightened. The Romulans had joined the war, but they had not joined the Federation. Some suspected that Sisko had played a deeper role in the entry into the conflict. The details remained hidden. The doubts did not. On Cardassia, the silence was heavier still. The orbital grid had failed. Chintaka was lost. But there had been no reckoning, only pressure. The Dominion, through Weyoun, offered hollow reassurances while subtly shifting blame onto Cardassian commanders. Their failures were unfortunate, their losses necessary. Behind every praise was a threat. Behind every smile, contempt. Among them, Damar began to drink more. He sat through briefings with eyes half-lidded and lips clenched. He repeated orders without conviction. The fire of patriotism was now a dull ember, barely growing beneath the ash. But it was not yet extinguished. In engineering bays and intelligence halls, Cardassian technicians began to whisper. Reports were redacted, errors disguised, small delays engineered. No one called it resistance. Not yet. But it had begun. And so the war dragged on. The Dominion had stopped advancing, but the Federation alliance had stopped winning. The Federation Council, reluctant to commit to another offensive, issued a hold position directive. There would be no second Chintaka. Not yet. Instead, engineers worked quietly on new defenses. Romulan subcommanders tested cloaked proximity mines. Starfleet analysts modeled Dominion fleet patterns using fractured subspace signals. The Klingons, ever stubborn, rotated in new bird of prey variants with hardened cores, unaware of the Breen weapon that loomed on the horizon. This was a war of whispers and attrition, of exhausted medics and demoralized crews, of victories measured not in worlds taken, but positions held another day. No one advanced, and no one surrendered. The fire lit at Chintaka had not spread, but neither had it gone out. And in the quiet between battles, alliances strained, leaders broke, and seeds of rebellion were sown. This was not peace. This was survival. This was the long winter. The Dominion had stalled. The Allies held Chintaka. Damar was drinking, and for a moment, the war seemed suspended. Bloody, but balanced. Then the Breen arrived. No one saw them coming. No diplomats, no long negotiations. One day, they were ghosts. The next, they were allies of the Dominion. The Breen Confederacy had long cloaked itself in mystery. Isolationist, technologically advanced, indifferent to galactic politics, or so the Federation believed. But the founders had made a deal. No one knew what was promised. Territory, technology, or something darker. What mattered was what came next. The war was ignited. The first strike came not at the front lines, but at the heart of the Federation. In mid-2375, Breen warships attacked Earth directly. San Francisco was caught off guard. Starfleet headquarters, thought untouchable, was struck by energy bursts that bypassed shields and vaporized entire sectors of the complex. Dozens were killed, hundreds injured. Panic swept throughout the Federation Council. For the first time in generations, Earth had been attacked from orbit. What the Borg had failed to do with brute force, the Breen achieved with precision. They shattered the illusion of safety. But not everyone was caught unprepared. Strike Team Echo, the same starfighter squadron led by the pilot known only as Sixto, was on Earth during the attack, rotated back for shore leave and flight recalibration. When the alarm sounded, they launched within minutes. Against a vastly superior force, Sisko and his wingmates, Ashton Pierce and Everett Johnson, flew intercept over San Francisco Bay, weaving through Breen fire, scrambling sensor locks, and buying precious seconds for the planetary shields to reactivate. Pierce's fighter was hit shielding a medevac transport. He ejected at the last second, recovered alive from the bay's waters. Johnson's stabilizers jammed mid-dive. He held his line anyway, ramming a Breen scout at point-blank range. When the skies finally cleared, the Breen had fled or been destroyed, and Earth still stood. The files listed it as Echo Red Response Protocol. To the survivors on the ground, it was Sisko's last run on Earth. And then they came for Chintaka. The second battle began like the first, with confidence. Starfleet, Romulan, and Klingon ships stood ready to defend their hard-won beachhead. But the Breen had brought something new. A weapon. One no one understood, one no one had seen, and one no one could stop. It was an energy-deafening weapon. It struck without warning. Spherical shockwaves of white-blue static, silently draining systems of power. Shields collapsed, weapons went dead, engines dimmed, consoles shorted and sparked. Ships didn't explode, they simply stopped. They drifted, powerless, defenseless, waiting. And then, the Dominion counterattacked. But not every ship drifted. At the rear of the formation, the USS Leopleurodon and the USS Zonterdal saw what was happening. With no time to warn the fleet, and no hope of surviving, both captains made the same decision. They surged forward, straight into the teeth of the Breen's fleet. Their ships would ultimately be crippled by the dampening field, but that didn't stop them from moving under momentum alone. No shields, no weapons, just burning inertia and defiance. The Leopleurodon slammed into a Breen cruiser mid-turn, cracking it in half. The Zonterdal, venting plasma and on emergency thrusters, collided with a Jem'Hadar battleship, triggering a detonation that disabled nearby attackers. Their sacrifice bought time. Just enough for a few more ships to escape. No orders had been given, no recognition awaited them. Only fire, silence, and the memory that they did not run. Among the casualties was the USS Defiant. Sisko's ship, his warhorse, his home, was struck early in the assault. She lost power, took direct fire, and disintegrated under the weight of the Jem'Hadar barrage. The Allies retreated. Chintaka, once the symbol of hope, was lost. Dozens of ships, Federation, Romulan, and Klingon, were destroyed. Hundreds of lives extinguished in silence. In the aftermath, the Romulans said nothing. No official statement, no public condemnation. Only silence and the quiet recalibration of war plans behind closed doors. Across the quadrant, fear took hold. At Starbase 375, engineers scrambled to understand the weapon. Initial theories suggested cascading overload fields, energy spikes that bypassed traditional defense protocols. It wasn't just power, it was control stripped away. Klingon vessels, with their redundant power matrices and decentralized warp systems, resisted the dampening effect better than most. Their crude strength had become a rare advantage. Within weeks, Martok's engineers began refitting older birds of prey with modified warp conduits, allowing them to remain operational, if barely, under Breen fire. Starfleet and Romulan engineers worked side by side, sometimes grudgingly, to build stopgap defenses. Power relays with automated disconnects, capacitor buffers, and rotating shield nodes. It wasn't elegant, but it was survival. The Alliance was bloodied, the Dominion was emboldened, but inside that victory, something shifted. Damar, once a puppet, now a patriot, broke. He had watched his people die in defense of the Founders. He had followed Weyoun's orders, smiled for Dominion cameras, repeated the lies. And now, the Breen marched through Cardassian cities as if they owned them. Damar had no more loyalty left to give. In a broadcast hijacked from a Dominion relay, he declared rebellion. Not in secret, not in whispers, but publicly, proudly, loud enough for all of Cardassia to hear. The Dominion is not invincible, and neither are the men who serve it. It was the first real fracture inside the Dominion's war machine, and it came from within. Across Cardassia, whispers turned into plans. Sabotage masqueraded as accident. Power fluctuations, delayed reports, and in some places, open fire. In the shadow of this turning point, other battles unfolded. Some political, some spiritual. On Bajor, Kai Wynn began to walk a darker path. Guided by a stranger, Dukat, in disguise, she turned away from the prophets and opened herself to the Pa Wraiths. What began as doubt became hunger. What began as spiritual yearning became ambition. Together, they plotted to unleash a force that had once been locked behind the gates of the Celestial Temple. The battle for Bajor's soul had begun again, not through phasers, but through faith. Not in orbit, but in prophecy. Back at DS9, Sisko stood at a crossroads. He had lost his ship. He had lost another piece of himself. But he'd also seen something else. Damar's rebellion. A sliver of hope. In that moment, he saw the war not as a line of battlefields, but as a story. A test. A prophecy being fulfilled. The Defiant would be replaced. The fleet would adapt. And somewhere inside the storm, the tide might turn once more. The Breen had struck at the heart. They had shattered confidence. They had ended momentum. But in doing so, they awakened something. Not just fear, not just rebellion, but belief. A belief that even in defeat, there still might be victory. And now, as the smoke rose over Earth and the stars above Chintaka grew quiet again, the war entered its final phase. And the gods were watching. Mid-2375. The Dominion stands at its peak. The Federation has been humiliated at Chintaka, Earth has been attacked, and the Breen energy-dampening weapon has shattered Starfleet's tactical edge. But even as the Allies brace for collapse, resistance is growing from within the Dominion itself. Legate Damar, once the image of Cardassian obedience, has had enough. Humiliated by Weyoun, ignored by the Founders, and watching his people subjugated on their own soil. He issues a call to arms. From a hidden base, he declares the formation of the Cardassian Rebellion. His message is clear. Cardassia belongs to Cardassians. Within days, Dominion assets across Cardassian space begin to fall. A Jem'Hadar birthing complex on Korma 3 is destroyed. A Vorta conditioning center on Synth Gol is bombed. These strikes aren't symbolic, they're surgical. The Rebellion understands exactly where the Dominion is vulnerable. The Dominion retaliates swiftly. Lakarian City, an urban center with no military presence, is reduced to ash. 2 million civilians perish. No evacuation, no warning, just silence, then light. The official death toll is staggering. The unofficial impact is even greater. Soldiers defect, families flee, and across the Union, loyalty begins to fracture. The Rebellion presents the Allies with a strategic opportunity. The Federation and the Klingon Empire move fast. dispatching covert advisors and encrypted transmissions. Officially, they deny involvement. Unofficially, they provide weapons, intelligence, and coordination. But not all in Starfleet welcome this alliance. Captain Benjamin Sisko understands the stakes. The rebellion could break the Dominion, but it also demands moral compromise. Starfleet is now fueling an insurgency inside enemy territory. At the same time, Dr. Julian Bashir's investigation into Section 31 takes a darker turn. He discovers the truth. Founders are dying of a genetically engineered virus, created not by the Dominion, but by the Federation itself. When Bashir requests access to Romulan virology archives to help develop a cure, the response is swift. No. The Romulans would not share the data. The virus may have been killing their enemies today. Tomorrow, it could be them. Though allies in name, the Romulans have not forgotten how they were brought into the war. Suspicion lingers. Some Senate factions quietly wonder if Starfleet has more secrets to hide. Romulan fleet activity subtly shifts. Rather than reinforcing front lines, they begin to reposition forces near the old neutral zone. Officially, they remain committed to the war, but strategically, they hedge their bets, preparing for chaos if Cardassia collapses too quickly. Still, not all Romulan actions are defensive. In the Galnor sector, an elite strike team disables a Dominion signal jamming array. The objective? Reopen comms between the Federation and Damar's resistance. A small act, but a vital one. Meanwhile, Colonel Kira Nerys, now with a Starfleet commission, becomes more than a political envoy. She becomes a resistance strategist. She trains Damar's lieutenants in guerrilla tactics, coordinates safe houses, and plans sabotage runs. The tension between them remains. Cardassian guilt, Bajoran rage. But in war, shared survival breeds respect. Across the quadrant, the tide begins to shift. The Breen weapon, once Starfleet's greatest threat, is now less effective. Redundant systems and adaptive shielding weaken its punch. Even its mystique begins to fade. In the Nelvar Expanse, Romulan warbirds launch a silent ambush on a Breen logistics station. The facility is disabled. The loss is never acknowledged by the Dominion, but the supply chain disruption is real, and the Allies notice. For the Dominion, the war becomes harder to control. Their cloning facilities are crippled, their new troops aren't arriving, their allies grow cautious, their enemies grow bold. And on Bajor, a different kind of war is beginning. Kai Wynn ultimately turns. She interprets the destruction that is being wrought on both the Federation and Bajor not as tragedy, but as prophecy. Prophets have failed her. With Ducat's manipulation, she embraces the Pa Wraiths and prepares Bajor for judgment. By the closing months of 2375, the Dominion is at war with the Federation, the Klingons, the Romulans, and now, itself. The rebellion is in full swing, and in the shadows, 1,000 silent wars have begun. By mid to late 2375, the Dominion was bleeding, slowly but steadily. The Cardassian rebellion had become more than a nuisance. It was now a legitimate internal threat, and with each Dominion loss, the cracks widened. Across every front, in every command, even within its enemies. To help sustain the resistance, Starfleet made a calculated move. Colonel Kira Nerys, once a terrorist, now a liaison, was assigned to Damar's forces. Alongside her came Garrick, the exile-turned-spy, and Odo, the shapeshifter tied by biology to the very enemy they fought. Kira's mission was clear: train Cardassians to fight like Bajorans once had. using asymmetry, sabotage, and the will to endure. But animosity ran deep. For many Cardassian rebels, working with a Bajoran officer, even a Starfleet one, was a bitter reminder of Cardassia's own brutal legacy. Kira didn't ask for trust. She demanded results. Then came the cost. Damar's family, his wife and child, were executed by the Dominion, not as punishment for rebellion, but as a demonstration. The Founders wanted obedience, not defiance. But rather than breaking him, it galvanized him. Damar was no longer a figurehead for Cardassian pride. He became its revolutionary. With Kira's guidance, the Resistance tactics evolved. Their most daring operation came when they hijacked a Dominion warship outfitted with Breen energy-dampening weapon. Their most daring operation came when they hijacked a Dominion warship outfitted with the Breen energy-dampening weapon. For the first time, the rebels provided Federation command with direct access to the technology. Within weeks, countermeasures were adapted, redundant power systems, resilient shield modulations. The Breen weapon was still dangerous, no longer decisive. But another battle was unfolding in secret. Odo had fallen ill, his morphogenic matrix destabilizing. What seemed like a rare condition was in truth a weapon. The same virus ravaging the Founders now lived in him. Dr. Julian Bashir, driven by loyalty and outrage, vowed to find a cure. His path led to the very source, Section 31. Together with Chief O'Brien, Bashir infiltrated the mind of dying operative Luther Sloan. Inside Sloan's fading consciousness, they extracted the formula. It was an ethically murky act, a violation of privacy, a psychic intrusion, but it saved Odo's life and exposed the Federation's darkest secret. Back on the front lines, even before the Federation Romulans could backwards engineer the Breen technology, the Klingon Empire faced its own reckoning. Chancellor Gowron, fearing Martok's growing popularity, had begun sabotaging his own generals. Reckless strategies and suicidal offenses undermined the war effort. Both Worf and Sisko saw the danger, and in accordance with Klingon tradition, he challenged Gowron to personal combat. The duel was brief and final. With Gowron's death, Worf named Martok as the next Chancellor, choosing to serve rather than lead. The Klingon war machine, stabilized and refocused, returned to the fight with renewed strength. Though the alliance held firm, not all partners were as steady. The Romulans, ever cautious, adjusted their priorities. With Cardassia destabilized, they began shifting fleet resources away from joint offenses and back towards sectors near the old neutral zone. They feared the collapse of the Dominion could trigger chaos, and wanted their borders secured. Despite success, the Resistance was splintering. Damar's image as a patriot clashed with the ruthlessness required to win. Civilians suffered, supplies ran thin, and more than once, Kira had to remind her allies that winning a rebellion meant doing more than surviving. It meant planning for what came next. Elsewhere, the spiritual crisis deepened. Kai Wen was still looking into the Pal Wraiths. With Dukat as her guide, she turned from prophecy to possession, opening ancient texts not to serve Bajor, but to dominate it. By the end of these campaigns, the war was no longer linear, no longer only fought in fleets and fire. It was political, ideological, and personal. It was about who would lead, who would survive, and what would be sacrificed to win. The final assault began on Stardate 52902.0. The Federation Alliance, Starfleet, the Klingon Empire, and the Romulan Star Empire massed for one last strike. Their objective? Cardassia Prime. But this wouldn't be a clean victory. The Dominion still held the planet with overwhelming ground forces. Breen allies reinforced orbital defenses. And even with Starfleet countermeasures, every loss felt personal now. On the surface, the Cardassian resistance was nearly crushed. Damar's movement had been betrayed. Most cells were dead. Only a handful remained, and they went underground. Damar had changed. Once a symbol of opportunism, now he had become a symbol of sacrifice. His mission was no longer to win, it was to liberate. As the assault unfolded in space, something even more pivotal happened below. The Cardassian fleet, witnessing Dominion cruelty and the genocide of their own people, turned. Entire squadrons defected mid-battle, firing on Jem'Hadar targets. The tide shifted almost instantly. The Dominion responded with fury. Entire cities on Cardassia Prime were destroyed. Over 800 million civilians were killed in less than a day. The cost of rebellion had come due. Damar led the push into the Dominion command. He died before reaching the Founder, gunned down defending his people. But Kira and Garak pressed on, breaching the heart of the Dominion operations. It was Garak, once an exile, now a patriot, who held a disruptor on the female changeling. But they didn't kill her. They held her. The final act of restraint allowed Odo to act. Linked through touch, Odo didn't just cure the Founder, he gave her understanding. In those final moments, the weight of the war broke through her conviction, and for the first time, a Dominion leader surrendered. The war was over. Ships powered down, Jem'Hadar laid down their weapons. The Great Link would survive, but the price was unimaginable. On the surface, Cardassia was dead, its cities hollow, its government decapitated. But its people, broken, angry, and free, would remember the name Damar. Elsewhere, a final confrontation burned unseen by fleets. Kai Wen, corrupted by ambition, had turned fully to the Pa-wraiths. Guided by Dukat, she sought divine dominion, not for Bajor, but for herself. In the fire caves, she opened the final texts, and she burned for it. Benjamin Sisko, emissary of the prophets, fulfilled his destiny, not as a captain, but as a guardian. He stopped Dukat, he stopped the Pa-wraiths, and in doing so, he gave his life to save people he had once been reluctant to lead. Peace returned, but not victory. Odo chose to leave, rejoining the Great Link to cure his people from within. It was not exile, it was duty. Kira remained on Deep Space Nine, its new commander. Worf became ambassador to the Klingon Empire, carrying Martok's banner into an uneasy post-war era. O'Brien returned to Earth to teach the next generation of officers who would live in the shadow of this war. The Romulans said little. They claimed victory, but kept their secrets. For them, the war had never been about honor. It had been about survival. The Dominion War had ended, but its scars were everywhere. In broken families, in collapsed governments, in buried truths. Peace had returned to the Alpha Quadrant. But no one walked away unchanged.